The wind howled outside like a living thing, shaking the old wood of the cabin as snow hissed against the windows. The dogs had been barking for nearly 5 minutes, long sharp bursts from Jet and the occasional lower uncertain growl from Molly. Something was out there. The man rose slowly, his joints stiff from the cold, and crossed the room to the door. He didn't expect anything. Most of the time, it was just the wind playing tricks or a branch cracking under too much weight. But this time was different. He cracked the door open and the wind hit him like a slap, ice and fury cutting across his face. The porch light flickered under the gusts, casting trembling shadows. That's when he saw it. Just beyond the threshold, curled tight against the wooden step like a forgotten rag, was something small and barely moving. At first he couldn't make sense of it. Not a raccoon, not a fox, too small to be a threat, but definitely not a house cat. The shape was unfamiliar. Its mottled fur was crusted with frost, thin chest rising only slightly with shallow breaths. One paw was bloodied, an ear was torn. The thing, whatever it was, shivered violently once, then went still. He leaned closer. That's when he saw the eyes. Half-lidded, glassy, full of pain, and for a single heartbeat they locked onto his. Something inside him seized. Then the eyes closed again. Jet pushed forward with a low growl, muscles tensed, but the man threw out a hand instinctively. No. His voice barely rose above the storm. Behind him, Molly hovered uncertainly, her tail tucked low, ears folded back. The old black lab didn't bark, just stood there, watching. The man's mind raced. This was Flagstaff, northern Arizona. They were used to predators out here. He'd seen coyotes, bears, even the occasional mountain lion. But this wasn't a stray or a threat. It was a baby. A wild baby. A bobcat kitten. The realization struck with strange clarity. Not just an animal. A wild thing. A thing that shouldn't be here. And it was dying. He should have closed the door, should have turned away. It wasn't his problem. Not now. Not anymore. But something about the way that small body lay it and surrendered like it had already accepted the end. Something about that made him hesitate. It didn't ask for anything. Didn't cry. Didn't even move. He reached for an old towel near the wood bin, the same one he used to dry firewood. Slowly, he stepped out onto the porch, knelt beside the motionless figure, and wrapped it in the cloth. It didn't resist. It didn't flinch. It didn't even shiver. Inside, he laid the bundle into a plastic storage bin lined with an old piece of fleece, Molly's first bed, faded and frayed but still soft. Jet paced in the corner, growling low, tail stiff with nerves. Molly lay beside the bin, silent. The man stood above the kitten, unsure of what he had just done. Its breathing was shallow, the kind of breathing you had to focus on just to see. In and out, fragile, rhythmic, weak. He found a baby bottle in the drawer, left over from a time that felt like a lifetime ago. He filled it with lukewarm water, gently pressed the tip to the kitten's lips. Nothing. Then a twitch, a slight flick of the tongue, a lick, then another, then nothing again. He sat back in his chair, the fire popping quietly, and stared at the wild thing he had brought into his home. He wasn't a vet. He wasn't even the kind of man who kept plants alive. He didn't know what he was doing. After his wife died, he stopped pretending he did. His name was still carved into the old mailbox out by the drive, but he hadn't opened a letter in years. No one called, no one came, and that had been just fine. Silence had become his world. It was easier that way. No expectations. No heartaches, just stillness. But now there was this creature, breathing in his house, a thing that didn't belong anywhere near humans. He stayed there all night, barely moving, just watching. At one point the kitten's chest stopped rising. He froze, his own breath halting. For a moment the world held itself still. Then with a gasp the kitten clawed weakly at the towel and breathed again. He cursed out loud. His hands shook. He didn't know why he cared, but he did. He fed it drops of water, one by one through the night. Spoke in a voice he hadn't used in years, soft and unsure, the kind of voice used in nurseries and farewells. He whispered words that made no sense, just sound to fill the quiet. And as dawn approached and the storm outside weakened into a gentle hush, he looked down into the bin and found the kitten staring back at him. Eyes wide open now, yellow. Not tame, not grateful, but present. A wild gaze meeting his. He felt something in his chest that hadn't stirred in years. This isn't some puppy, he muttered to himself. This isn't something I get to keep. But the kitten didn't leave. It just lay there, chest rising and falling like it borrowed each breath from someplace far away. He looked at Jet, still pacing near the door, occasionally letting out a low whine. Molly hadn't moved all night. She remained by the bin, her eyes focused on the kitten with an intensity he couldn't explain. He hadn't named a single thing since his wife died. Nothing new, nothing alive. But as the night stretched thin and the sky outside lightened, the name slipped out of him like breath. "Kai," he whispered. He didn't know why. Maybe because it sounded like wind through trees. Maybe because it didn't feel like loneliness. Maybe because it felt like something beginning. Kai. He stood, his back aching, and opened the cabinet. Cans of soup, rice, peanut butter, nothing for a bobcat. He stood there too long, hand on the doorframe, staring. Jet whined again behind him, tail tucked low, nails ticking across the floor. The man boiled water, let it cool, added sugar, a pinch of salt. He didn't know what else to do. Another baby bottle, another attempt. And this time, Kai drank. Not much, a few sips, but it was something. His paws twitched weakly. His ears flicked when Jet barked at a squirrel outside. The man sat on the cold floor, cross-legged beside the bin, watching something wild choose to live. He had no idea what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Kai die alone. The storm passed slowly, leaving behind a heavy quiet that settled over the trees like a blanket. The man didn't sleep that night. He stayed beside the bin, seated on a cold chair he'd dragged into the garage, feeding Kai drops of water one at a time, whispering nonsense into the shadows as if his voice alone could keep the kitten breathing. He didn't know what he was doing, not really, but he did it anyway. With each gasp, each flicker of life, something inside him softened, just a little. Something that had been frozen for a very long time. There were moments when Kai's chest stopped rising, just for a beat, a pause that made the man go still with fear, leaning closer to make sure it wasn't the end. And each time the kitten clawed faintly at the towel and gasped again, dragging air into its lungs like a creature not ready to go. The man found himself cursing out loud, angry at the fear, at the helplessness, at how much he suddenly cared about a wild animal that didn't belong in a home like this. But caring didn't ask for permission. He watched the snow fade into stillness outside the window. When the grey light of early morning crept across the floor, it fell on the bin where Kai lay curled, eyes open now. Not wide, not curious, but open, golden and watchful. The kitten's gaze met his, and something passed between them. Not recognition, not trust. Something deeper. A presence. A choosing. It was the first time in years someone had looked at him like that. He reached for the bottle again and offered it gently. This time Kai licked with more strength. Only a little, but enough. The man held his breath with every movement, every swallow. Kai's paws twitched like he was reaching for something. His ears flicked faintly when Jet barked at a bird outside, but he didn't flinch. He drank. He stayed. Hours slipped by like fog. The man barely moved. Molly did, though. At one point, she padded forward slowly and lay beside the bin, her muzzle resting along the plastic edge. She didn't bark, didn't whine. She simply watched, her tired eyes calm and knowing, never leaving Kai's face. Jet remained distant, still pacing occasionally, sharp glances thrown toward the kitten. He was young, uncertain. His instincts screamed conflict, but he hadn't challenged the man's authority. Not yet. By late afternoon, the fire was low, and so was the light. The man rose stiffly, joints aching, and covered Kai with another towel. His hands lingered longer than they needed to. He didn't know if the kitten would survive another night, but if he didn't, he wasn't going to die in the cold. Not alone. Not again. He stepped outside briefly to chop more wood. The snow was deeper now, covering the trail behind the house. The silence beyond the trees stretched for miles. He paused mid-swing, looking back at the cabin. It stood small and quiet, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. What was he doing? This place had been built for solitude. After the fire, after the loss, it had become his refuge. No visitors, no voices, just the rhythm of survival and the comfort of silence. He had sealed the world out with thick walls and colder habits, and yet here he was, wrapped around a life that didn't belong to him. A wild thing was breathing under his roof, and it stirred something he thought had died long ago. He returned inside and fed the fire. The wind outside picked up again, howling like it was searching for something it had lost. He didn't sleep in his bed that night. Instead, he dragged the chair into the garage and sat again beside Kai. Every hour, he checked the kitten's breathing, adjusted the towel, offered more water. He whispered old memories, broken prayers, things he hadn't said out loud in years. Near midnight, Kai opened his eyes once more. In the flicker of firelight, they glowed, wild, ancient, golden. The man leaned in, his breath catching. They stared at each other for a long time. Then the kitten blinked, closed his eyes again, and slept. The man told himself again not to get attached, not to hope. But he already had. He knew that now. The realization didn't scare him as much as it should have, maybe because it was too late. By morning, frost crusted the windows, the cold bit deeper than before. The fire crackled constantly, demanding attention to keep the air even remotely warm. The man moved slowly, his body stiff, but his focus clear. He opened the garage door quietly, not wanting to wake a silence that had become sacred. Kai was still there, breathing. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady rhythm, not the erratic gasps of the night before. His fur was dry now, slightly fluffed with warmth, and his body no longer trembled. The man crouched beside the bin and watched for a moment. Then, carefully, he reached in and lifted the kitten with both hands. Kai didn't resist. He barely opened his eyes, but he leaned faintly into the warmth. The man brought the bottle to his lips again, and this time Kai drank, not just a few drops, but slow, desperate gulps that said he still had fight in him. The man felt his own chest shift, as if something heavy had loosened. A breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding finally released. Jet whined from behind the garage door, restless. The border collie hadn't truly relaxed since Kai arrived. His high-strung energy had now transformed into something more primal, uneasy, territorial. He didn't understand what Kai was. But Molly did. She remained calm, watching with quiet understanding. To her, the kitten wasn't a threat or a stranger, just something that needed care. Later that day, the man cleared a small table in the garage and moved the bin closer to the light. He set up a space heater nearby and draped a towel to block any drafts. Then, for the first time in weeks, he opened his laptop. The screen lit up, casting an unfamiliar glow on the worn walls. His fingers typed frantically. How to feed orphaned bobcat kitten. Is it legal to care for wild bobcats in Arizona? Bobcat rehabilitation near Flagstaff. He wasn't looking for permission. He was looking for answers, looking for hope. He found a wildlife supplier online, a place that sold kitten-specific formula for orphaned animals. Better than sugar water, real nutrients. It was expensive. He clicked buy now without hesitation, paying extra for 2 days shipping. 2 felt like forever. That night, Kai stirred in his sleep, small movements as if dreaming. The man reached in to adjust the towel and felt a tiny paw press against his hand. Not clawed, not flinching, just contact. Barely there, but deliberate. The man froze. He hadn't touched anything delicate in years, not since her hands had cooled in his own, not since the end. Everything since had been rough, firewood, metal, tools. But this was soft, and it was trusting him. Later, he moved Kai from the garage into a small box lined with flannel. He placed it on the floor of the living room, close enough to the stove for warmth, but far enough for space. Molly curled nearby without hesitation. Jet kept his distance, pacing the edge of the room, his eyes locked on the box. The man sat in his worn chair, wrapped in a wool blanket. The bottle warmed in his hands, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Kai made a sound, something between a breath and a cry. Not a meow, not a growl, just a sound of presence. The man didn't respond with words. He just reached out and tucked the towel closer around the kitten, gentle, like folding memory. This wasn't what he planned. He had meant to give the creature one night, one small act of mercy, but already he knew one night was no longer enough. By the time the second morning rolled in, the Chewy box finally arrived. The man had been watching through the frosted window for hours, boots already laced, pacing like an expectant father. When the delivery truck disappeared down the drive, he stepped out immediately, coat barely buttoned, snow crunching under his feet. The box wasn't just a delivery, it was hope, sealed in cardboard and tape. Inside were 2 small containers of specialized wildlife formula, designed for kittens like Kai. It wasn't much, but it felt like medicine for a dying child. He rushed back in, hands trembling with the cold and anticipation, and set the containers on the counter with reverence. Kai had already grown stronger in just those 2 days, but his body still looked skeletal. His ribs pressed sharply against his thin fur, and though he moved a bit more, it was clear his fight wasn't over. The man mixed the formula carefully, following the instructions to the letter, then held the bottle between his palms until it was just warm enough. He cradled Kai in his hands and brought the bottle to his mouth. The kitten drank without hesitation. It wasn't frantic or fearful, it was intentional. Hungry, yes, but measured. His eyes opened more now, glassy and gold, filled with something both ancient and fragile. The man fed him slowly, whispering encouragement he barely recognized as coming from himself. Every movement Kai made stirred something in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Tenderness, purpose, the ache of becoming responsible for something alive again. He moved Kai from the bin to a soft crate in the living room, lining it with fleece and surrounding it with pillows. He kept it close to the stove for warmth. Molly never left the spot. The old lab had taken to resting beside the crate like a silent guardian, her chin often placed just inches from the kitten's side. She didn't ask for attention or direction. She simply watched, her presence solid and unshakable. Jet was different. The border collie had become a nervous blur of motion, pacing the room in loops, pausing only to stare hard at the crate. He barked when Kai sneezed. He growled when the man picked the kitten up. His energy was a sharp contrast to Molly's calm, a pulsing line of tension in an otherwise quiet house. The first real confrontation came when Jet got too close. Kai had been lying on a heated towel when the dog crept forward, his body low and slow, his eyes narrowed. A quiet snarl built in his throat. The man saw it a second before it grew into anything worse. "Back," he said sharply. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Jet froze mid-step, ears pinned flat, tail low. The room went still. The man's heart was racing. He hadn't raised his voice in years, and the sound of it echoed more than it should have. Later that day, it happened again. Jet inched forward, while Kai was curled against the edge of the towel, and this time, before the man could react, Molly moved. She stood abruptly, stepped between Jet and the kitten, and positioned herself like a wall. She didn't growl, didn't bark. Her body was still, her gaze unwavering. Jet stopped. He backed away without protest. The man said nothing. He didn't have to. Whatever had passed between the two dogs had settled something deeper than words. Molly understood what Kai was, and now, it seemed, Jet was beginning to as well. That evening, the fire burned hot in the stove, casting warm light across the worn wood floor. The man sat in his chair, blanket wrapped tightly around him, eyes fixed on the crate. Kai stirred inside. His movements were more coordinated now, his body stronger. And then, slowly, shakily, the kitten pushed himself up. His legs trembled under the weight of his small frame, but he stood. For the first time. It wasn't graceful or sure, but it was effort. Determination. He shuffled forward, wobbling toward the edge of the crate, and let out a small rasping sound. Half cry, half question. The man leaned forward, eyes wide. Kai reached the lip of the crate and tried to climb out, his claws catching the fleece. Just as he began to tip sideways, the man caught him. He scooped the kitten gently into his hands, holding him close, feeling the rapid beat of a tiny heart against his fingers. Kai didn't struggle. He just looked up, eyes locked on the man's face. Wild eyes, trusting eyes. "You're not supposed to be here," the man whispered, his voice tight. "You're not supposed to need me." But he did. And the man, whether he wanted to or not, needed him too. That night, the wind picked up again. The trees outside moaned under the weight of snow. The man stayed by the fire, Kai tucked into a thick towel against his chest. The kitten's body radiated faint warmth, his breathing steady and slow. Jet lay nearby, still tense, still watchful. Molly was asleep, her soft snores the only sound besides the crackle of burning wood. The silence in the house was no longer hollow. It was full. It held something now. The man leaned back and closed his eyes, his hand resting gently on the bundle in his lap. "Kai," he whispered again. The name slipped from his lips like breath, familiar now. A sound he hadn't meant to speak more than once. But now, he couldn't stop saying it. Sometime deep into the night, he awoke to scratching. Not the soft, unsure twitching of a recovering kitten, but sharp, deliberate, rhythmic claws against fabric. He sat upright instantly, the blanket sliding from his chest. Kai was gone. The crate was empty. The towel inside was ruffled, flannel edges hanging just slightly over the floor, torn at the corner. He stood up too fast, heart pounding. The room was still. Jet was already on his feet, alert, tail stiff. Molly stood near the front door, whining low, her body tense but unmoving. The man didn't think. He just moved. He opened the door. Cold air burst into the cabin like a wave, biting and harsh. Snow covered the world outside in a sheet of stillness. But there, on the porch, was a trail. Tiny prints, uneven, staggered, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. Kai! The name tore from his throat, sharp and helpless. He grabbed his coat, flashlight, boots, his hands trembling as he stumbled outside. The trail was fresh. Kai had run, and he was out there, alone. The snow was thick and deep, and every step felt heavier than the last. The trail of tiny prints led down the slope behind the cabin, weaving through bare brush and brittle limbs. The man moved fast, faster than he should have in the snow, slipping more than once, catching himself with trembling hands. His flashlight cut through the grey dawn, the beam darting between tree trunks and shadows. He could barely breathe, not from the cold, but from the panic rising sharp in his chest. The prints began to falter halfway up a small ridge. The spacing grew erratic, the pattern less certain. Then came something worse, blood. A thin smear against the snow, bright red, painfully fresh. The man stopped cold, staring at it, refusing to believe what it meant. "No," he muttered, his breath pluming into the air. "No, no, no!" He pressed forward. The wind howled through the trees like it was chasing him. Every shadow became a threat. Every broken branch or brush of snow sounded like the end. The forest closed around him, darker now, despite the light beginning to creep through the sky. The trail twisted, faded, reappeared, and then he saw it. A small shape, curled tightly under the roots of a fallen pine, nearly buried in white. Still. He dropped to his knees, snow soaking through his pants instantly. "Kai." His voice cracked. He reached forward with shaking hands, lifting the limp body from the snow. The kitten didn't move. His paws were raw, cracked and bleeding, his fur crusted in ice. His body was so cold it barely felt alive. But under the silence, under the stillness, there, a breath, just one. Faint. The man wrapped him tightly in his coat, pressing the tiny form to his chest. "You stupid, stubborn little thing," he whispered, voice breaking. "Why would you run?" His hands gripped tighter. "Why would you leave?" But there was no answer. Just the whisper of trees and the sting of wind against his cheeks. He carried Kai back to the cabin like something sacred. Inside, the fire had dimmed, so he stoked it immediately, piling logs onto the embers until the flames surged back to life. He moved quickly but carefully. Space heater on, towels into the dryer, blankets wrapped and folded. Everything in motion now. Everything mattered. He sat on the floor, Kai bundled in layers against his chest, rocking slightly, instinctively. Jet stayed back this time, quiet for once. Molly lay close, her chin resting on the man's boot, eyes wide and unblinking. Minutes passed, then an hour, then longer, and then movement. A twitch, a breath. Kai stirred, the faintest shift beneath the towels. The man pressed his forehead gently to the kitten's, closing his eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Kai was alive. That night, he didn't leave the fire. He stayed there, arms wrapped around the fragile body, holding on like it was the only thing anchoring him to the world. Because maybe it was. Because somewhere in the middle of the blizzard, in the middle of all that cold and silence, something wild had chosen to trust him. And he wasn't going to lose it. Not now. The fire burned low again by dawn. He added another log and crouched beside the crate where Kai now slept. His breathing was steadier, his body warmer. The man had cleaned the wounded paws with warm saline, wrapped them in soft gauze, his fingers working with a gentleness he didn't know he still had. "You've got the whole forest waiting for you," he murmured as he tied a bandage. "But you won't make it if you keep running before you're ready." Kai twitched in response, but didn't wake. The man sat back and wiped his hands clean on a cloth. He went to the kitchen and prepared food. Wildlife formula mixed with softened meat, warmed slowly until it gave off a scent rich and familiar. He returned with a shallow dish, coaxing Kai awake gently. "Come on," he whispered. "Don't make me chase you through a blizzard again." Kai licked the mixture once, then again, then leaned in. It was enough. "You're wild," the man said softly, watching every bite. "I know that. You don't owe me anything." His voice caught and he paused. "And I'm not trying to keep you." Jet lay nearby, his chin resting on his paws. He didn't bark. His ears twitched at each sound Kai made, but he didn't move. Molly was closer, as always, her breathing slow, eyes half closed but alert. Something had changed. Jet began to creep forward, inch by cautious inch. His posture was low, tail neutral, eyes uncertain. When he got too close, the man lifted his hand instinctively. Jet stopped. "Easy," the man said. "He's not yours. Not yet." Jet didn't growl, he simply looked. Something about the stillness in that moment pressed down on the room like the edge of a decision waiting to be made, as if they were all waiting for something none of them could name. The man turned to Kai, adjusting the towel gently around him. "You're going back," he whispered. "You don't belong in these walls. I know that." He glanced down at the tiny wrapped paws, but not yet. Jet exhaled sharply, a short breath that broke the tension. Molly stirred slightly but didn't move. The wind outside had calmed, no longer a storm, just a breeze, a whisper through the trees. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. Cold mornings blurred into long, muted afternoons. The man woke early, his body falling into a rhythm he didn't question. Feed Kai, clean the crate, check the bandages, adjust the heater. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always to Kai. "You're healing," he said once, running his thumb down the kitten's back. "But don't get used to this." Kai no longer flinched at touch. He leaned into it, his body stronger, his breath more certain. Jet had stopped growling altogether. During feedings, he often sat close to the man, watching, ears flicking with every movement. Molly remained a steady presence. She rarely left the crate, except to eat. Her posture was relaxed but protective. It wasn't permanent. The man knew it. They all did. Even Kai. Something was building, a tension that had shifted from the kitten's body into the cabin's walls. The man tried not to name it, but it lingered anyway. That was when the knock came. Just before dusk. Not a loud bang. Just 3 sharp raps on the pinewood door. Jet barked instantly, bolting toward the front. Molly stood slowly, ears perked. The man froze. No one ever came out this far, not in winter, not since the funeral. He opened the door cautiously. A man stood outside, bundled in a thick camo jacket, chewing on the edge of a glove. His truck idled at the bottom of the path. "Evening," he said. "Name's Dean. I'm the new ranger covering this section. Got a call from town about a Bobcat sighting near the cabins." The man's heart sank. "You seen anything like that?" Dean asked, peering past him toward the warmth of the house. "Young male Bobcat, real small. Locals are nervous, say it might get close to dogs or livestock." The man shook his head. "Haven't seen a thing." Dean paused, nodded slowly like he knew a lie when he heard one. "Well," he said, stepping back, "if you do, best not to get involved. Wild ones don't do well when people try to make pets out of them." "Yeah," the man replied, his voice thin. "I know." Dean left without another word. The moment his truck disappeared, the man locked the door. He didn't feed Kai on the floor that night. He held him instead, close to his chest, silent, hidden. "They know," he whispered. "Or they will soon." Kai blinked up at him, eyes calm. "You're not staying," the man said. "I promised, but not yet. Not like this." He looked at Molly, Jet and Kai, and suddenly it struck him. He wasn't alone anymore. And it terrified him more than the ranger ever could. The fire burned low that night, casting long shadows against the walls. The man didn't sleep. He sat in his chair, Kai curled tightly against his chest in a thick towel, Molly close by, Jet pacing near the door, still tense. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin like a warning, not a storm, but a whisper of something coming. The man's thoughts kept circling back to the ranger, Dean, and the way he had looked at the cabin, as if he already knew what was inside. He held Kai closer, breathing in the scent of flannel, smoke, and something faintly wild. He didn't speak the decision out loud, but by morning it was already made. The moment the sun slipped above the treetops and the frost on the windows began to melt, he moved. He didn't explain anything to Jet, who stood by the front door, ears low and tail still. He didn't say a word to Molly, who followed every step with her steady, mournful gaze. He just moved with the quiet determination of someone who knew what had to be done. He packed a small bundle, some formula, a little food, a heating pad wrapped in flannel, a few towels. He lined an old wooden crate with them, careful with every fold. Then he crouched by the living room fire, lifted Kai from his soft bed and gently placed him inside. The kitten didn't protest. He looked up, his amber eyes slow to blink, calm in a way that cut deep into the man's chest. "You're stronger now," the man whispered. "Strong enough." Jet whined once when the man reached for his coat. Molly stood beside the crate and refused to move, planting herself like a stone. The man ran a hand down her side, his touch barely steady. "I know," he whispered to her, "but he's not ours. You know that better than I do." She didn't follow when he opened the door. Snow was falling again, slow and fine this time, like ash from a distant fire. The trees stood tall and still, their branches heavy with silence. The man carried the crate through the woods behind the cabin, past the fallen pine, past the old fire road that led nowhere anymore. He walked until the house disappeared behind the ridge, until all that remained was the soft crunch of his boots and the weight in his arms. He found a hollow beneath a spruce tree, sheltered by dry brush and framed by stone and earth. It was warm enough, safe enough. He set the crate down gently and opened the lid. Kai didn't leap. He didn't bolt. He stepped out with care, each paw finding the snow with quiet grace. He turned once, looked back at the man with those golden eyes, and then padded into the undergrowth, disappearing into the hush like he'd always known where he was meant to go. The man waited. He stood there for what felt like hours, snow collecting on his shoulders, breath steady in the cold air. Just when he was about to turn back, Kai reappeared. He didn't come close. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He stood at the edge of the trees, half in shadow, watching. His gaze never wavered. Then, without a sound, he turned and vanished into the forest. The man walked back alone. Jet met him on the porch, barking softly, tail low and wagging with a kind of anxious relief. Molly stood just behind him, her body still, her eyes questioning. The man didn't say a word. Inside, the cabin was warm, but it felt hollow again. The crate in the corner was empty, the towel untouched. The fire crackled like it was trying to fill the space, but it couldn't. The silence returned. The man sat in his chair and stared at the flames. For the first time since she died, he felt the full weight of letting go. It wasn't the silence that hurt. It was what had filled it. The life, the movement, the sound of breathing that wasn't his. 3 days passed. The house was still. The routines remained. The fire, the food, the cleaning, but without purpose. The crate sat untouched in the corner. The dish stayed full, but no warm body curled beside it. The man kept pouring water every morning, out of habit more than hope. He still glanced toward the door every time the wind shifted, knowing nothing would be there, but hoping anyway. Jet grew restless. He paced the cabin more often, scratched at the back door for no reason. The man took him out twice a day, walking the same trail that cut through the trees, past the ridge up the slope. Molly came once, then chose to stay behind. She preferred the stillness now, resting by the hearth where Kai used to sleep. On the third morning, they reached the midpoint of the trail when Jet bolted. No sound, no warning, just a flash of motion, black and white fur slicing through the snow. "Jet!" the man called, heart lurching. "Jet!" But the dog didn't stop. He followed. Through thick brush and tangled thickets, stumbling over roots hidden beneath powder. Branches whipped his face. The wind was bitter, cutting through his coat. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. Still no sign. The trees here were unfamiliar, the snow deeper than he remembered. Panic began to take root, not loud but cold, settling into his ribs like ice. And then, movement. Just beyond the bend in the trail, past an old spruce heavy with snow, Jet stood still, tail wagging, ears high. Alert! Beside him, half hidden behind one front leg, was Kai. The Bobcat stood taller now. His frame had filled out. His coat was fuller, speckled in earthy browns and faded gold. But it was him. Those same amber eyes, that same quiet watchfulness. The man froze. Jet looked up at him, then back down at Kai. His tail swayed once, slow and steady. Not anxious, not afraid. The man dropped to one knee, unsure if his legs would hold him. He didn't call, didn't reach out. He just waited. Kai stepped forward once. Then again, then stopped. Close enough to see the steam of his breath, but not close enough to touch. Jet stepped back slightly, giving space. Kai sat down. The forest held its breath. Then, just as quietly, the kitten stood again, turned and began walking, past the man, down the trail toward the cabin. He didn't hesitate. He knew the way. Jet followed, and the man, after a long pause, did too. They walked home together. The man opened the cabin door without a word. Kai walked in as if he remembered every corner, every sound. He moved quietly across the wooden floor, stopping near the edge of the rug by the fire. His small paws left damp prints in the melting snow. He didn't hide, didn't dart. He turned, sat, and looked up at the man, waiting, not for approval, not for permission, just for presence. Jet shook off the snow beside him and flopped down with a sigh. Molly lifted her head slowly. Her ears perked. She saw Kai. He saw her. He walked straight toward her. The man held his breath. Molly didn't move. Kai stopped inches from her, sniffed the air, then slowly curled beside her flank and rested his head on her outstretched paws. The man looked away, blinking hard. That night, he didn't bother with the crate. He laid an extra blanket by the fire, thick and wide, and watched as Kai made his way to it on his own. Jet curled up nearby. Molly shifted just enough to stay close. No one spoke, no one made a sound, only the fire crackled, only the breath of something returned. Later, the man brought out a dish of food, softened meat, warmed formula. He placed it gently beside the blanket. Kai ate slowly, then looked up, his gaze steady. The man sat in his chair, not too close, not too far. "You came back," he said, and that was enough. Outside, the snow fell in a slow, delicate hush, blanketing the trees and softening every sound. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth. The fire burned low, casting dancing light across the wooden floor. Kai lay curled tightly between Molly's flank and Jet's stretched-out paws, their three bodies forming a quiet knot of breath and fur. The man sat in his chair, wrapped in a wool blanket, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. It was quiet, not empty, but full. He never tried to keep Kai after that night. The days that followed came like breath, soft and steady. In the mornings, the man would wake early, the same way he had for years, but now with a purpose that reached beyond routine. He would step down into the living room and look toward the blanket by the fire. Sometimes it was empty. Kai had slipped out during the night, vanishing the way wild things do, silent and sure. But other mornings he'd find him still there, curled up near Molly, paws tucked under, breathing slow and deep. The man would prepare food, always the same, softened meat, warmed formula, nothing fancy, just familiar. He would set it near the edge of the blanket and retreat, letting Kai come to it in his own time. When the food was untouched, he didn't panic. He simply opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch with his coffee, letting his eyes wander toward the ridge beyond the trees. Some mornings he saw nothing. Just snow, just wind, just the soft motion of pines swaying gently in the quiet. But other mornings he caught glimpses, a flicker of movement between the trees, a silhouette frozen atop the ridge, watching, amber eyes catching the light for just a heartbeat before slipping back into shadow. Kai was out there, not lost, not gone, just free. Jet began to change. The anxious pacing that once consumed him faded. He no longer barked at every sound or growled when the wind rattled the windows. He moved through the house with a calm the man hadn't seen before, watchful but at ease. He followed the man more slowly now, no longer racing ahead, but staying close, steps measured. Molly aged gracefully, her movements slower, but her presence no less steady. Her eyes remained sharp, her gaze knowing. She seemed to understand something the man couldn't quite name, something about cycles, about return, about letting go and still being whole. The house had changed. The silence that once defined it had softened. It wasn't a shield anymore, not something to hide inside. It had become space, space that allowed things to move through it, to come and go, to heal. The man began to walk farther, past the ridge, down the creek trail he hadn't followed in years. Sometimes Jet would come along, nose to the wind, tail relaxed. Sometimes Molly would join for part of the path, then settle beneath a tree, content to wait for their return. The man started leaving food along the trail, not bait, not invitation, just quiet offerings tucked behind rocks, nestled in roots where snow wouldn't bury them. He didn't expect anything in return. He just left them, just in case. Once, just once, he found paw prints leading to one of the spots, small, clean, confident, not frantic, not lost. He stood over them for a long time, snow falling gently around him, the silence of the forest wrapping close. At night, the cabin glowed warm again. The fire, the dogs, the rhythm of something restored. It wasn't the life he once had, but it was something, and it was enough. He would still sometimes speak into the quiet, not loudly, just a few words as he sipped his coffee or moved around the room. "You're out there," he'd say, or "Stay warm tonight." He never expected a response, but some part of him believed the forest heard him. And when Jet paused on a walk, ears high, body alert, the man would stop too. He'd look toward the trees, searching the shadows. Once he caught sight of him, Kai, perched on a low branch, barely visible. The wind stirred his coat. His gaze locked with the man's for only a moment. Then he was gone again, slipping into the woods like a secret. But that was enough. He didn't need to touch him, didn't need to speak. Trust, once built, didn't need to be caged. It only needed to be honored. As weeks passed, Kai came less often, or maybe just less visibly. The man never chased, he never called, but he always looked. He'd leave the back door open for a few minutes each night, just in case. And some nights, when the wind shifted just right, he swore he heard soft paws across the snow, just outside the light. The dog seemed to sense it too. Jet would lift his head, ears tilted. Molly would stir slightly in her sleep but not rise. They knew the rhythm now, knew it wasn't about ownership or possession. It was about connection, about presence. And the man, he had learned finally to let the wild come and go. One evening, as the snow fell again, he sat in his chair near the fire, dogs curled beside him, and whispered, "You'll leave again, when it's time." He looked toward the door. "I'll be ready." He wasn't sure if that was the truth, but it didn't matter. Later that night, just before sleep pulled him under, he glanced down one last time. There, in the glow of firelight, Kai was curled tight between Molly's flank and Jet's outstretched legs. Their breathing synced, slow and peaceful. The man let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The cabin didn't feel like it was just holding on anymore. It felt full. And in the days that followed, even when Kai wasn't there, the feeling stayed. The mornings came quietly. The snow kept falling. The world turned slowly and gently. The man walked. He fed the fire. He opened the door and sometimes, just sometimes, he'd see two amber eyes in the trees. Not needing anything, not asking for more. Just watching, acknowledging. And the man would nod, slow and steady, like you do when an old friend passes by. Because when something wild chooses to trust you, even for a moment, it changes everything. It reminds you that love doesn't need to be owned, that presence doesn't mean permanence, that some homes are built not to hold but to open, and that healing, real healing, comes not from keeping something but from letting it return over and over in its own time, quietly, freely, faithfully.